topic. I've kept the introductions brief because your resumes and your experiences are vast. I hope you don't mind that. We will talk about the current state of the European security architecture and try and take out a little bit of a crystal globe to see where we might be headed. And as you can imagine, I did a little bit of homework. I went and dug up some old documents, and it reminded me that about 30 to 35 years ago, when we were talking about European security, it was really a different moment in time. There was a certain era of euphoria, if you will, where we were talking about cooperative security, where confrontation had ended, and it was all about a united effort to build a new and free Europe. And this mindset was reflected both in the national security strategy documents of nations in the Euro-Atlantic space, including obviously the other side of the Atlantic, but also in the capstone documents of international institutions, ranging from the OSCE to the European Union to NATO, obviously. And it's quite sobering to look at those documents. I went through the OSCE documents, for example. I looked at the 1990 Paris Charter. I looked at with a little bit of bias, I looked at the 1999 Istanbul document as well. And really that notion of cooperative security and working for a common good is such a prevailing theme in all of these documents. And it was coupled with very many confidence building measures, transparency measures, that really built a different era in the security architecture. And add on top of that, obviously, all of the arms control and disarmament elements that were in place. It was really, it seemed to be a more euphoric, predictable era at the time. As I said, we're very much in a different state right now, and I think the true paradigm changer, obviously, has been the war in Ukraine. The security lens through which all of the nations and institutions, for that matter, are looking at the international landscape, I think, is one of the main outcomes of this result. And this mindset also, this changing paradigm, has been reflected again in both national security documents of very many nations, but also in the capstone documents of institutions. The Munich Security Conference came out with a report this year, and it dubbed the era, as we see it right now, as one of lose-lose, basically highlighting the fact that the prevailing approach, if you will, among states is one of a zero-sum game, which is very much in contradiction to the mindset that was prevailing in the era that I was talking about. And this is also reflected, as I said, in the documents of both nations and institutions. I see this a little bit as a fog descending on the European security architecture, a fog which is characterized by a lot of unpredictability, a heightened sense of risk, and serious fragmentation. We're in a very securitized and fraught security landscape. And this is compounded by other challenges, such as technological developments and the absence of governance structures, efficient, globally recognized, accepted governance structures on issues like AI and automated weapons systems, for example, that have become increasingly an important element in conflict scenarios. And I haven't even spoken about climate change or the migration challenge. So there's a lot to talk about, and we're very lucky to have this outstanding panel to speak about. And the questions that come to my mind against this background is there a security architecture left to talk about? Can we actually contemplate, given the state of affairs right now, of an inclusive and mutually acceptable for all of the actors security architecture? Is it even too ambitious to contemplate anything like that, given the circumstances? Or is it now that we need to start contemplating these ideas? And I keep looking to you because I'm going to be very unfair and ask you to roll the ball and tell us, both as the Secretary General of the OSCE, which is very unique, obviously, because of, first of all, its membership spread, which is the largest in that sense in the Euro-Atlantic area, but also because of the comprehensive way in which the OSCE approaches security from various dimensions. So I'd be very interested to hear from you how you see the current situation and how you see it evolving. Thank you. Welcome again.
Thanks so much, and good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And indeed, I think you're right. I think 35 years ago, probably we couldn't have imagined to see a return of violent warfare on European soil, which of course has a dramatic impact on Ukraine in the first place, but it's affecting the whole of the OSCE region and beyond. I mean, in some of my bilaterals earlier today, we were talking about food security, and I pay tribute to your country that has been very much engaged in this respect. And you recalled a bit the history. It's true that from its earliest days, the OSCE stood for shared security, cooperative security, and we have the tools, the mechanisms. And let me say they were used. I mean, take the Vienna document, which is the core remaining pillar of the 1996 framework for arms control. It was used several times in the lead up to the 24th of February 2022. But you know, organizations, we can offer our good services, we have the tools, but then you need the political will. But having said that, I think it's also important to recall the origins of this organization. You mentioned the 90s, the good days, but then this organization is born out of confrontation, is a child of confrontation in the Cold War, and we are not like-minded countries. And I'm always underlining that because we have a different role from NATO or the European Union. And you need that. You need different approaches, you need different formats, different tools to address the security challenges of the 21st century. And what do I mean by that? I think you need a platform, and the OSCE remains a unique platform, also with the 57 participating states. And you already referred to the way we approach security, the comprehensive approach to security. Even if today the focus is so much on hard security, but from the earliest days, really, the OSCE was very clear that it's never only political military security. You also need to consider the ecological dimension, increasingly so the economic dimension and the human dimension. I'm on my way to Ashgabat. I will meet the 5 ministers of environment there. We help countries really to work together, regional cooperation, to tackle some of the key climate security related issues, and most of them are transboundary. Or take, in the economic sphere, take corruption. It's an impediment to peace. Or the human dimension, media freedom, and in the era of social media, or the role of new technologies in human trafficking, a hugely underestimated crime. We work on all that, but I would say the guiding thread is really the work that's done on a daily basis on conflict prevention. This is with the institutions, our field missions. We are in Southeastern Europe, in all of the Central Asian countries, and also we help the Central Asian countries to tackle with the challenges that, because of the Taliban takeover, I mean, this is a bit on the back burner these days, very relevant for them. Or take Moldova, where we're the only ones that are monitoring the security zone. And maybe one other point I would like to make, I am a huge supporter of the new Agenda for Peace of Secretary General Guterres, which is about strengthening the roles of regional organizations when it comes to conflict prevention. And also we need to broaden, in a way, the constituencies for conflict prevention. What I mean is bring in those who are underrepresented, the women, youth, but also national minorities. It's the work our High Commissioner on National Minorities does. Maybe a last point, because you mentioned it, and this I think is very important, and this is arms control. There's a lot of focus now on nuclear, and rightly so. But we shouldn't forget about conventional arms control. So indeed, in the 90s, there was this really impressive overarching web that was built with CFE, the Treaty on Open Skies. It's all dramatically weakened because of withdrawals, suspensions. Vienna document, the only one left. But I would say that, and it's probably a bit premature to talk about it now, but the OSCE presents an unparalleled platform for negotiations on military security, risk reduction, everything related to European security. And not to forget, and you also hinted to that, is that things have evolved over time. So we have to adapt to the new military realities with hypersonic warfare, artificial intelligence. If this is not done, it will be very difficult to build a predictable security environment. So to conclude, I think what the OSCE is maybe one, but an important piece of the puzzle when it comes to European security, because of our unique platform, because of the way we approach security, and also our current chair Malta has been very clear. It's about principled engagement, defending the values, the commitments, but bridge building at the same time. That's, I think, our unique added value.
Thank you. My takeaway from what you've said is, even though there may be all of the fragmentations and challenges that we speak about, the OSCE has the legacy of actually coming around common solutions to other challenges. And nowadays, many solutions require these types of solutions. So maybe that is where the starting point of reconstituting a security architecture lies.
And not to forget the work that's done on a daily basis, because to tackle some of the other challenges out there. I mentioned climate change. I didn't want to be too long. This is happening on a daily basis. The problem with conflict prevention and mediation is that if it's successful, the results never make it to the daylight, and that's also good. Conflict makes it to the daylight. But it's so important to continue that work on a daily basis. And preserve the organization for as an unparalleled platform, also for arms control.
I think you've tempered my comments in a positive manner by giving us a little bit of an upbeat expectation maybe, which is very good and much needed nowadays. Mr. Minister, I'd like to turn to you, if I may. Switzerland is a very unique country, obviously, given its neutral status in a very fraught security environment. I'm aware of a study that was done internally in Switzerland prior to the war in Ukraine, looking at the security architecture, the challenges for Switzerland and how it should adapt. And then you commissioned a supplemental study to that after the war in Ukraine. And I think one of the interesting things that I noted was there were discussions even on the future of the status of neutrality, even discussions around possibly joining NATO or not, which was ruled out at the end of the report. But one thing that came out from the report that I captured was that there was a stress on the need for international cooperation, increased international cooperation. And meanwhile, of course, you've joined sanctions against Russia, and that has brought a bit of a rebuke from Russia. So I'd be interested in hearing how you, given your specific and distinct status, if you will, are looking at the security landscape in Europe and how you envisage its evolution.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the invitation, of course. I was thinking about how to begin, because it is such a large question. Given to our history, we decided very soon in the history, almost 200 years, it was the Congress of Vienna, 1815, but actually, truly, it was 200 years earlier, in the 17th century, to have a neutral attitude towards wars among surrounding countries. But because at that time it was the time of wars between Germany, France, and Italy, and so on. And of course, this was given to the fact that we exist as a kind of spin-off of those countries, Germany, France, Austria, and Italy, and because of the central powers of these countries, of the kings. And this creates a kind of social psychology which aims to be independent, And it was also in the interest of the surrounding country that Switzerland was independent. It was a buffer zone between them. So it was a complicated mountains, Alps, and so on. And the buffer zone, it's a good thing. So you don't have to touch together. Now, we have, necessarily, we had to find a way, being that, because it was not our choice, it was the choices of the big powers around us, giving us the duty to be neutral. And we tried to make out of an obligation an asset, an instrument of existing, of bringing ourselves as a nation into the international community. And we were successful in the First and Second World War offering good offices, mediation, facilitation, being neutral, even in the African continent, never being a colonial power there, and so on. And this was almost the way on which we are by now. Then, of course, we, like every other country in the European continent, couldn't imagine to get war back in that manner, as we saw on this February 24th, early in the morning. And suddenly it was the question, okay, how do you have to interpret the history at this very moment? And we realized how important it is to be even more involved in this community of the continent. We are at the very heart, geographically, and geography is politics. So we have to choose and to have a cooperative way of being neutral. And this is actually what the Swiss government decided to do, join the EU sanctions and trying to find out the best ways to cooperate with, yes, we are aware of the fact that we are a permanent neutrality with an army, but I mean, we are a 9 million people country, and the army is a 9 million people country's army. We can't expect now to have capability to really be hard in the defense. But we were aware to be surrounded by countries belonging to the NATO, and that is for us a security matter, of course. And we want to cooperate with NATO. We are doing that on the peace promotion. We have been cooperating for more than 10 years now. And now we decided to make some steps ahead to have a little bit more cooperation. It is not at all the question about joining the NATO. It is in Switzerland. It is even dangerous to speak about that. But to cooperate a little bit more is important. At the same time, we have to be useful in our very particular status. And to be useful how? For instance, in humanitarian assistance, in international humanitarian law, in the protection of that, of the idea of promoting that. We also decided to finally to join or to be elected in the UN Security Council, where we are now at this very moment. This was the first time in history for Switzerland. And for many decades, very, very, very actively discussed in the public because of neutrality. And now we are there, and we are contributing to facilitating the dialogue among countries not speaking with themselves. And we see it's possible to do that and to be at the same time neutral. Neutral means just we are militarily neutral, according to international law. It does not mean indifference. It does not mean we are not values. We have values in our constitution. We are a member of the OSCE. We want to be part of the European security architecture, of course. But again, we won't send any weapons or troops to Ukraine or doing something militarily close to the war. Another way, and this was the last, maybe the last issue, another way to contribute to the international community is peace promotion, so, or conflict resolution. Now we have been asked by Ukraine to organize a high-level summit, high-level conference on peace in Ukraine, after 4 meetings at the National Security Advisor level, beginning in Copenhagen, ending in Davos early this year, in January. And we answered yes to the Ukraine, but let us do the way we want. Because just to speak about the Ukraine peace process, it's enough for Western countries. But if we want to have peace there, we need Russia, and we need the BRICS countries, and we need a broad alliances of all countries in the world. And so let us please explore the best way in order to kick off this process. It won't be just a conference. It won't be the first conference on a pathway, on a process aimed to reach peace. And this is the way we are offering our activities for the international community. We are now in an exploring phase for this conference, and it should take place before the summer.
Mr. Minister, thank you very much also for highlighting how a country like yours with this distinct neutrality status is trying to find niches where it can contribute to the shared challenges in the European security architecture and actually beyond. And also for explaining a little bit for our benefit the characteristics of the neutrality, because it doesn't mean indifference, as you said. It's good to corroborate that here. Scott, welcome again. I'd like to turn to you. Happy birthday in advance to NATO, 75th anniversary this year. It is a big achievement, obviously, for the alliance. Numbers matter in this case, in the sense that I think it corroborates the fact that NATO has really been a successful political military alliance, the most successful one in history. And I'm a little biased because I worked there, but I've recognized that one of the reasons behind NATO has sort of reached this recognition, if you will, though there's a lot of critics out there as well, clearly, is its ability to adapt. And I remember in the early 90s, again, when we were talking about that era, the adaptation was an increased stress on cooperative security because war had ended and peace was to prevail, and NATO was adapting itself to that notion. Cooperative security remains one of the core tasks of the alliance, and is reflected as such in the recently agreed NATO strategic concept as well. But I'd be interested in hearing from you now that obviously the security landscape has changed in the manner that it has, and NATO is adapting in a different way by enhancing its deterrence and defense measures, by increasing its readiness, by proving, in my view, that it's neither obsolete nor brain dead. I'd be interested in hearing from you how you see, from an alliance perspective, the current state of the architecture, the security architecture in Europe, and how you see it evolving and how NATO is adapting to that reality.
Alper, thanks so much. So first, I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here, to be on such a great panel and talk about these things. And I really think when we talk about the future of the European security architecture, looking at the way that NATO is evolving, has evolved over the past 2 years while the security landscape in Europe has changed so drastically, is a great way to look at what future security architectures need to look like. I think the, as state-on-state war has returned, it is a reminder that collective defense is something that matters a lot within the region, and that as we face down the most serious crisis to European security since World War II, what we find is that the values and the appeal that NATO has to offer becomes even more attractive. And in fact, I think that what we find is that this effort by Vladimir Putin to shatter the Cold War, post-Cold War order, has instead unified many of us about the value that order actually represented, and the need to ensure that it persists. We've all been impressed by Ukraine's resilience. We've all been impressed by Ukraine's bravery, and I think that with that, it reminds all of us that NATO's core mission really is about collective defense of our 31, soon to be 32 allies. NATO, in response to the war, we have fundamentally changed our approach to planning for conflict. We have evolved NATO into a structure that could be a war-fighting organization structure if needed. We've modified our plans. We've introduced new plans so that we actually could fight a war if needed. And we've ramped up our capabilities and our efforts across all domains, everything from land, air, and sea to space and the cyber domain as well. And in the information space, where we all find ourselves increasingly challenged and at risk. And all of this ultimately, fundamentally, enhances the security that we have from the Baltic to Turkey. It really does increase our security all across there. And the changes that we've seen in NATO's membership, I think, really reflects how the security architecture in Europe is evolving. We have added Finland. We will very soon add Sweden as a member. If we were talking about this 2.5 years ago, I don't think any of us would have talked about that as being something that was anywhere on a near-term horizon. And so in record time, faster than we've ever done in history, we added an ally of Finland. And again, Sweden will be there very, very soon. And I think that, again, this all reminds us that, that in the face of aggression, as has been said many times before, what Putin's demands before the war, he's gotten exactly the opposite. He has more NATO borders with Russia than he had before, and I think that, that the appeal of the values that we represent and the open door that we offer ultimately is positively positively shaping the security architecture of the region. I think the you know, when we think about how that membership is transforming security in the Baltic, we are emphasizing a lot the need for greater resilience, and certainly Finland and Sweden bring great expertise, great experience with resilience, and that's something that all allies and all of us need to be very focused on, is resilience in the face of the challenges that we face today. It's very high on our agenda. We saw that reflected in the summit in Vilnius last year. And ultimately, this is the way that we safeguard our nations. And we take this all very, very seriously. And that's why NATO allies now are reevaluating our ability to be resilient and to respond to challenges in this unprecedented security environment that we're in, which is defined by strategic competition and greater instability across a wider range of threats, to include climate change and information space, all of those other areas. We see today threats that come from state actors as well as non-state actors. We remain very concerned about terrorist attacks. We remain very concerned about cyber and hybrid warfare, all those areas that are that now blend that space between conventional and unconventional conflict, where it is far easier today to execute some sort of cyber attack, or even a disinformation campaign that ultimately has great negative impacts on security that are far with great much more impact than that would have had just a few years ago. So we think about those challenges, as well as climate change, earthquakes, even pandemics, all of those things that really emphasize the importance of civil-military cooperation and far more integration to build greater resilience there. In this line, I would encourage everyone to read NATO's new strategic concept that we produced at Madrid in 2022. It really is, I think, a very good piece of strategic thought from NATO about how to prepare for the security challenges that we face now, for global competition, for instability. In that, you will see, as no surprise, that we see Russia and the menace of terrorism as the two greatest threats that we all face. But we're also making efforts in this to as I said, to respond to climate change and to think about the impact that China has on our security situation and the shared values that we have. But most importantly, that new strategic concept, it reaffirms our values. It reaffirms that we are that we're committed to our core values, that we are committed to collective defense of our 31, soon to be 32 allies. And I think what's important is that our societies all understand this. In fact, our latest polling shows that 82% of the populations in NATO countries understand and appreciate the value that NATO plays, that they believe that it is important for North America and Europe to work together for our shared security. And obviously, Russia's war against Ukraine has only solidified that thought within those countries. Another simple truth that comes from this, though, is that Europe's security ultimately is directly tied to Ukraine's security, that ultimately there is no secure Europe without a safe and secure Ukraine. So that continues to drive our firm commitment that Russia cannot win in Ukraine, and that ultimately the only security guarantee for Ukraine that will work is NATO membership at the right time. The other thing that has come out of this conflict that I think impacts the future security architecture is the sharpening line between what happens with Euro-Atlantic security and those things that happen to the east of it. If you look to the left of that line, what you see is peace is holding. Diplomacy is still, our first resort to resolving issues and disagreements, and that our security we still define mostly cooperatively. But if you look to the right of that line, you see a nationalist Kremlin that sees itself at war with the collective West, that is ultimately bent on exerting control of the so-called Russian world and doing that through brutal means if and when necessary. Ultimately, we think that Russia's failing military adventure in Ukraine will dramatically expose the gap between the ideology and the reality, and that that this will ultimately be a test for Russian resilience of the Russian economy as well as Putin's leadership. Ultimately, I think that, lastly, I should say that it is important to note that NATO will stand by and stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes, and that we will defend every inch of Allied territory from Turkey to Finland. Right? We are not at war. NATO is not a party to this conflict. Russia is not at war with NATO, but we are instead supporting Ukraine's right to self-defense, which is enshrined in the UN Charter, which Moscow is desperately trying to lay waste to. So ultimately, I think and it's important for all of us to remember, and again, important for the future of our security architecture concepts, that we can't let Putin win this conflict because it sends the wrong message to authoritarians elsewhere. And ultimately, if authoritarians believe that resorting to force for this type of achieving these type of illegal goals, ultimately that makes all of us far less secure. So it's something that we all have to be united about.
Scott, thank you. If you don't mind, I'm going to interrupt you here because I'm going to try and come back to you. But this was a good, I think, sequence of reflections from the OSCE, from a country at the heart of Europe with a very distinct status, and obviously the NATO perspective, and what you've outlined explained to us how the securitized focus inevitably, given the international landscape, is driving the adaptation that NATO is going through. Looking at it from the other side of the story, I think there are critics that would say that that is a source of escalation, whereas on NATO's side, obviously, it is in reaction to the act of aggression that Russia has undertaken against Ukraine. Natalie, you do not represent a government. You do not represent an institution. You are liberated just like I became when I left the foreign ministry and joined Carnegie, so I will challenge you if you don't mind, and I know you will reciprocate. You recently wrote a wonderful article. I'm an avid follower of your work for The Guardian, where you spoke about the splintered nature of the world. You defined it as the West versus the rest, but you were not talking necessarily about Euro-Atlantic security, though you referred to developments there, but you also referenced what's happening in Gaza and beyond, and the heightened tensions and how the world is really splintering. Now, I want you to zoom in from that background, if you will, to the Euro-Atlantic security architecture. Given what we've heard here, the question that's on my mind is, here we are, we're talking about the European security architecture. Is there one left? As I said, I haven't heard an answer to that yet. The possibility to build it even when the situation is fraught is there. It's in the history of the OSCE. But the real elephant in that question is, are we talking about a security architecture that actually includes Russia, or is it one that is against Russia? That's the question I want to throw at you.
So let me put it in these terms, and let me perhaps just start off by making one kind of rather broad conceptual point, and that is the way in which we are changing, in fact, we have changed fundamentally the way in which we even think about security in the Euro-Atlantic space. So indeed, once upon a time, it was about cooperative security, it was about integration, whether this was European integration, NATO, whether these were various forms of neighborhood policies, association agreements, the OSCE. So that was the world we lived in. It was a world in which integration and interdependence were viewed as sources of security. We then started shifting out of this world, right? And we went through a phase which, I would put round about 2014, in which we started understanding that it wasn't quite like this, or it wasn't only like this, right? Now, it didn't change fundamentally. Because although, of course, conflictuality with Russia increased, particularly, it should have probably done after 2008, but it really did do so after 2014. But we lived still in a world in which we thought we had to at least selectively cooperate with Russia. And here we have Helga that in her previous incarnation spent a lot of time, right, negotiating together with Russia on issues like the Iran nuclear deal, right? And that's just
This is at the EU.
Absolutely, and that's just one example. Since 2022, we have moved into a world in which we conceive of security not only, in fact, not at all, as with, but as against. What I mean by against is in protection from Russia. And this has had fundamental implications on a number of issues and a number of institutions, many of which we've already started talking about. And I think it's also faced these institutions with fundamental challenges and I would say contradictions. And let me perhaps just make 4 very brief examples. The European Union. So enlargement is back. Hooray. We have now reminded ourselves of the strategic value and nature, the strategic imperative of enlargement. Good. However, that strategic imperative, in a way, also sits at times uncomfortably with a transformational logic that underpins enlargement, right? Because if you have to enlarge because it's a security imperative, because you now know that there isn't some sort of fuzzy gray zone, you can be a little bit in, a little bit out, and you're not perfectly secure and democratic and prosperous, but you're more or less stable. No, we now know that this is a frontier Europe. You're either on one side of the divide or on the other side of the divide, and as we were saying earlier, if you're on the other side of the divide, there are things like invasions that can happen, right? So all of a sudden, enlargement is back, but if it's back because it's a strategic imperative that is driving it, surely it doesn't really matter if you're perfectly democratic, if you perfectly meet all the standards, right? I mean, if it's something that has to happen because it's existential, how do you make these two things coexist? And I think that's a set of issues that particularly the European Union has to deal with. You then move on to NATO. So NATO is back, right? Again, in a Europe that understands its security as being in protection from Russia, NATO is definitely back, as we know. It's, last thing in the world it is brain dead, as we know. And yet, NATO is also, I think, grappling with a number of questions. Now, on the one hand, it's as a source of opportunity, in a world in which the membership between the European and NATO increasingly overlaps as a consequence of NATO's enlargement with Sweden and Finland. And we haven't really talked about it because we would go to the other side of the Atlantic, but as there is, of course, a question mark that is on everyone, certainly on European minds, as to what will happen after next November, there is this debate about, should we dust off the shelf ideas such as the European pillar in NATO? Is this an organization in which ultimately Europeans have to take on greater responsibility for their own security and defense, right? And what does this mean basically for the future of NATO? And then thirdly, I would say there are the pan-European organizations, of course, of which, the OSCE is the king here. And Helga's absolutely right. Of course, the OSCE was never really meant to be an organization of like-minded countries. And indeed, there are all sorts of conflicts that have been playing out within the OSCE for many years, in fact, for many decades. Think about the East Med, think about the Caucasus. However, and this goes back to the point that you were making and the idea of security and protection from, it is in a sense unprecedented the way in which now this is not a conflict that plays out within the OSCE. This is a conflict in which the Russian Federation views the OSCE as antagonistic, and it's having all sorts of implications. You know, just coming in here, we were sort of talking about, for instance, the financial implications for the OSCE, right? Which really put a massive question mark on the sustainability of this organization. And then you have, last point that I'll make, I wouldn't call them, well, it's not an organization, but certainly it's a format that has emerged, in a sense, as a consequence of this blockage. For instance, the European political community, right? Which, again, is not meant to be a gathering of like-minded in the sense of, you know, it's not about democracy and human rights and all the rest of it. It's like-minded to the extent that it values sovereignty and territorial integrity. Well, surely that is something everyone should agree to, apart from one, in fact, two, right? So, you know, sort of, you know, with that Russia, Belarus, you know, exception, in a sense, you take the sting, which is in the OSCE, but then the EPC also has all sorts of questions, right? I mean, you can do useful things being a talking shop for a while, but then if you want to move from talking to acting, well, you need a structure, right? And that is something which I think that particular grouping has not resolved. So I guess to sort of, you know, cut a long story short, yes, we are, and I'm not saying this is a good thing, I'm simply saying that this is the reality of the Europe that we live in. It is a Europe which understands itself in protection from, you know, if there was a Russian sort of sitting at my place, he would probably be saying, I'd say he, because normally it probably would be a he, right? But he would probably say exactly the same thing in reverse, yeah? I mean, you know, sort of Russia understands itself. This is, you know, the Great Patriotic War 2.0, right? So it understands its security in contrast to Europe. So, you know, I think we simply cannot change this reality for the time being. The question is, how does it then play out in all of these bits and pieces institutionally that used to make up and that will still make up, but in a very different way, the European security architecture?
Yes, I think that leaves us in a very complicated place where all of the elements, all of these stars are in the universe, but they haven't lined up yet. And I don't think the critical threshold in terms of the perceptions of the individual actors in the Euro-Atlantic security architecture have come to the point where there's a realization of the need to actually find a common way forward. And that's where I think a lot of responsibility will go to particularly institutions like the OSCE. We have a hard stop at 4, and we have about 12 minutes. So if you don't mind, unless you have anything else you would like to add, I would like to turn to the audience. But before I do that, I'm going to do something terrible. My former diplomat reflexes kicked in when I heard you talk about EU enlargement, securitized perspective. Don't forget Turkey would be my motto, because I really think that's a mistake there. And I would like to turn to the audience. Are there any questions? Do not miss this opportunity, please. Yes, please. If we can have the microphone for our friend here, please. If you can introduce yourself very briefly and keep it short.
Okay,
please.
thank you. I'm Efe Gürbüz from UNDP in Turkey. So I have a question for Mr. Scott Bray. So Professor Jeffrey Sachs was here, I think, 10 minutes ago or an hour ago. So he assessed that the Russian-Ukraine war starting in February 2014 was a result of missed opportunities and provocations rather than an unprovoked attack by Vladimir Putin. And Sachs criticized the actions of the US and NATO, pointing to their overthrow of the Ukrainian president in 2014. So he also criticized the portrayal of Putin as a madman and underscores NATO's enlargement, particularly its eastward expansion in the mid-19s, as a reckless move worsened the conflict. Sachs also highlights the failure to build on Gorbachev's vision of a common European home after the Cold War, opting instead for a US-led unipolar world. So my question is, does NATO address Sachs' analysis, particularly regarding NATO's actions in 2014 and its role in the eastward enlargement, along with the missed opportunities for cooperation with Russia? Thank you.
Just a clarification, Jeffrey Sachs was here in the previous session. It was a perspective from the Global South, and he had mentioned these aspects. Obviously, the ASG is here representing NATO, not in the US capacity, just to clarify that.
So I would just say a couple of things very quickly to that. First, I think that what you'd find was that NATO was very open to a lot of cooperation with Russia in the post-Cold War timeframe. So one, there was a lot of outreach, there was a lot of engagement. And nothing at all ultimately could justify Vladimir Putin's illegal aggression into Crimea, into Ukraine. So ultimately, I think NATO was open to cooperation. I think that we demonstrated that, and I think that again, nothing could ultimately justify the illegal actions then that Putin took. So I've heard that argument before. I've never found it compelling of something that would justify what we've seen.
Thank you for that. Yes, please, another question from this direction, if there are other questions.
Bahar Rumelli from Koç University, and I have a question to Natalie Tocci. This transition you talked about from a notion of security with to security from, is this a temporary transition that is going to end once Ukraine's territorial integrity is secured, or is it a more permanent transition? Was security with notion wrong from the beginning?
Nothing's obviously permanent in life, but I think that it's something that goes beyond Ukraine. And I think it's something that goes beyond Ukraine because of the way in which the narrative in Russia on this war has changed actually quite dramatically over the course of these last 2 years. So it started off being a war against the neo-Nazis in Ukraine, right? And it was about the Nazis and about demilitarization, a bit of NATO, being the problem, but it was about Ukraine. Now it's, and I cited earlier the Great Patriotic War 2.0, not by coincidence. Now, that didn't really work very well. I mean, it didn't really kind of, the passion was not very high amongst, sort of the Russian public. Now, the Great Patriotic War 2.0, that strikes more chords, right? So I think basically what you're having, and it's, and it's not just, quote unquote, a question of narrative, it is, Russia, sort of setting itself into a war economy. It is about increasing its troop presence along the NATO border. So it has re-articulated itself in terms of, and its identity being based in contrast with the West. I actually, but here maybe I may be pushing myself a little bit too far, I actually think that a permanent state of war with the West is now a prerequisite for regime survival in Russia. So no, I don't see this ending in Ukraine. And I think at the very least, hopefully it will, but I think we should assume that it may not be, and it may last a lot longer.
I'm going to abuse my authority here, sitting in this seat, and turn to you, Mr. Minister, if I may, and pick up on something that you mentioned that links into this. You spoke about the fact that when you were talking to the Ukrainians, possibly about hosting a meeting in regard to the situation in Ukraine, you made the argument that it had to be at one point that also has the Russians on board, because that is how peace will be made possible. To the extent that you're willing to share it, what were the reactions, and do you envisage a way in which we can overcome these obvious barriers and the psychological barriers that have naturally been built around what Russia has done in Ukraine, basically?
This is exactly the issue about it, and I totally agree with your view of things. This is the new reality. We are in this narrative 2.0, and the narrative is Ukraine is not our enemy. Ukraine is just an instrument.
Exactly.
An instrument for a view of the world which was not right, and we see the end of the Western society because they have loosened in themselves in their discussion about many not useful things, and it is at that level that the discussion should be driven and should be made. And if you're not ready to talk at that level, we won't have any chance to come ahead. It is just more of the same would not bring anymore. So I think we should be ready to have this view of the situation and then to go down to decline it to a more operationalized way of finding solution. We still don't know exactly how. We are discussing it with many countries, with a broad number of countries, not Western countries, very unlike-minded countries, like Helga Schmidt said before. But these countries are participating to this narrative of Russia, and they are discussing almost daily with them. And we are in a new world, and we have to reset our mindset in reading the reality. And I guess if we don't have this approach, it won't be possible to go ahead.
Theorists of the law of war, or excuse me, of the history of war, look at the conflict in Ukraine, and I've read multiple assessments arguing, unfortunately, that neither side is yet at the stage in which they believe peace is a better option than what is going on. Obviously, Ukraine doesn't have that choice. It's defending its country, but that's one of the challenges. May I turn to you, if you don't mind? I'm interested in the implications of this atmosphere on the functioning of the OSCE. I think Natalie gave a very good example as to the challenge. To the extent that you'll be willing and able to share, I think that would be useful for the audience to know, because the capacity of the OSCE to contribute to this challenge, to overcoming this challenge, is huge, but obviously it's incapacitated by the internal challenges because of the war. So I'd be interested in hearing your views, if you can.
No, indeed, and indeed, Natalie is right. I think, of course, we have been affected, like every multilateral organization, like the UN has been affected. And every chair since 22, it started with Poland, North Macedonia last year, now Malta, has kept Ukraine as top item on the agenda every Thursday when the 57 ambassadors meet, including the Russian delegation, also to defend the values and the principles. And I think the point here is, do we still all believe in the Helsinki principles? Inviolability of borders, territory integrity, sovereignty, which is a key issue, because the view has been very much by really the large number of participating states in the OSCE is that it's not the principles that have been invalidated. I think this is very important. But you asked me about how the OSCE has been affected. So yes, we have been affected, because obviously it's very difficult to reach decisions by consensus. At the same time, and this was important for me to say at the beginning, we are not dysfunctional or paralyzed or dead or half dead, as some have been writing, because we have found a way to work. Take Ukraine. I think we have, the OSCE has now more than 70 staff in Kiev with a special representative that is appointed by the chair that does need consensus, and 34 countries plus the European Union are funding more than 20 projects there, like humanitarian demining, cybersecurity, and other important issues. Or a lot of the work we do is extra budgetary funded. I would rather prefer it comes from the unified budget, but if this is not possible, then it's like that. And this is very, very important work. It's part of conflict prevention. It's related to cybersecurity, the fight against terrorism, climate, I mentioned already. But take cyber, for example. This is an issue, an example I always give is, this is still working at 57. So we are the first organizations that agreed the confidence building measures on cybersecurity. What does it mean? That if today an incident happens, we have this focal point network that can be immediately activated to see, was this now an accident or was this a deliberate attack? And this is quite important to make sure that things don't spiral out of control because of ICT, and this is working. So there are areas that are working, crucial ones. There's a lot of work done in particularly with our field missions, our institutions, but of course at the bigger political picture it's become very, very difficult, including budget. But we found a way, also thanks to the generosity of many participating states in the OSCE.
How wonderful to end on a positive note. I have to apologize from everyone. There are numerous hands that have been raised, but unfortunately we've run out of time. I would simply thank our participants and ask them to congratulate and thank our panelists for the contribution. Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope
It
that
was really
okay.
short.
Absolutely.